So welcome everyone to this event. This is an event on with the University of Wolverhampton Social Work and Social Care, and we're looking in this event at working with perpetrators of domestic violence. I'll just wait a minute or so to give everyone time to get into the event, and then we'll get started. Right, so I think people have had time. There probably will be some people joining after now, but hopefully most people have got into the meeting. So yes, welcome and thank you everyone for coming to this event. I'm just going to start with some basic introductions around how the event's going to work, and just some sort of basic housekeeping. So obviously the event's 2 hours long. Mostly the first sort of half or just over half of the event will be will incorporate people's presentations, talking around programs and research around the area of intervening with perpetrators. And then after those presentations, there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions. If participants could put questions into the question and answer box rather than into the chat, that would be really helpful. It makes it easier for us to identify the questions and for the participants to respond, for the panelists to respond to the questions. But obviously they can respond to some of the questions in writing, but it also makes it easier for us just to pull those questions out and ask them for you quickly so we can get as many questions as possible answered. We won't be using the raised hand facility, so all questions will need to be asked by via the written questions on QA box. If you are going to, the chat facility is available, but if you are going to use it, just remember that this is a public platform. The session is being recorded, and so if you can just avoid putting any confidential or information into that chat that you wouldn't want to be made public outside of this, webinar. And so, yeah, no, that's that bit. So I will get on just to introducing our guests as a first port of call. They will then introduce themselves a little bit more. So for speaking first, we have Professor Liz Kelly, who is a professor and director of the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University. Sorry. At London Metropolitan University, and she holds the Roddick Chair on Violence Against Women. Liz has been active in the field of violence against women and children for 40 years, and she's the author of the book Surviving Sexual Violence, which established the concept of a continuum of violence and over 100 book chapters and journal articles. Liz is also a person who created the DASH risk assessment, which I'm fairly confident most of you will be familiar with from your work with people who have experienced domestic violence. In 2000, Liz was awarded a CBE in the New Year's Honours List for services combating violence against women and children, and as a result of her important work in the field. And in January 2005, Liz was appointed the Board of Commissioners of the Women's National Commission. On Twitter, Liz's profile is Professor Liz Kelly, so you can follow her there. And I know that she does tweet about stuff on fairly regularly, so I'll put that into the chat function as well, so if anyone wants to follow her. After Liz, we have two people from the National Probation Service. We've got Lilli Odira, I think. You might have to correct my pronunciation of your name, Lilli. Lilli was a probation officer with the National Probation Service prior to joining the Community Rehabilitation Company Bench in 2019. She's been with the project since 2019 before being seconded as a domestic abuse officer to Luton Borough Council and now Peterborough City Council. Amber Salamate is a probation officer as well with the National Probation Service, and she's been seconded into the Cambridgeshire County Council as a domestic abuse officer and covers the Fenland area. And they're going to talk about their particular programme. It's, I can't remember the exact names. It's Strengthening Families, I think.
No, we're the Family Safeguarding Project.
Oh, Safe Family, yeah, that's it, thank you. And then finally, we've got Nina Malik, who is a psychologist from and a Freedom Programme trainer and facilitator. She has worked with over 300 men who attend the Men's Freedom Programme for perpetrators of abuse. She also facilitates the Freedom Programme in Urdu and working with women who've been subjected to abusive tactics by men. She's also researching currently Muslim men's identity and male violence in the UK. So hopefully with that really excellent range of speakers, we're going to have an opportunity to have a really good discussion about working with perpetrators of domestic violence. So at that, I will hand over to Professor Liz Kelly for her to begin her talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. A little disclaimer, I didn't devise the dash, and I actually have really significant issues with most forms of risk assessment, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that later. It's not my work. Okay, so the first thing we need to have a conversation about is why we need to work with perpetrators, but also to just ask which perpetrators as well. From the very beginning of work around domestic violence in the 1970s, the issue of accountability of perpetrators was a critical one. It has always been on the agenda. The debates, if you like, are about how that accountability should take place. Having said that, most of the interventions that have been developed and have become institutionalised focus on supporting women and children. And one of the things that I think is becoming more dangerous in relation to that is that there's a danger of what we call responsibilisation, that because we focus on women and children, we end up making women responsible for their own safety and that of their children. And because we don't focus enough on perpetrators, we've got a number of men who just move from one relationship to another and become serial perpetrators. So those are two very big reasons for me about why we ought to work with perpetrators. One of the other things I think it's really important to say is that agencies are already in contact with them. They're just not working with them as perpetrators. They're working with them as parents or as somebody who's got substance misuse problems, or as someone who's involved in youth justice. That there's all sorts of places where workers are encountering perpetrators, but not working with them as perpetrators. The interventions are most developed in relation to domestic violence. There was a lot of work on sexual violence perpetrators in the 1980s, but as far as I'm concerned, it's all been lost. And there isn't that much work that I'm aware of working with perpetrators of other forms of violence against women and girls. So our knowledge base is actually quite limited to one form. The ones who are worked with are most likely to be in touch with the criminal justice system and or children's safeguarding. So they're least likely to be white middle class men. There's a whole group of perpetrators who are not in the purview of institutions at the moment. There's been a call last year for a national strategy around perpetrators, and the government announced £15 million last month, but I couldn't find any details of where and how that's going to be spent. But that's the context that we're talking in, that there is a national conversation about this at the moment that we all ought to want to be part of. So if we think about the story so far in relation to domestic violence perpetrators, because I can't say that much about any other work, it begins in the 1970s in the US, the Emerge program in Boston, and that gets picked up here in the 1980s in Scotland and in England, linked to this model of coordinated community response from Duluth. And there were multiple routes into these programs, and they tended to work with those in the criminal justice system and from other routes together. But that changed when all the work was taken back in-house into probation in 2000. Lots of different origins and practices, but most of them drew on that power and control framework that any of us who work in this field are aware of. There is a model that's specific to the UK, where there was this absolute requirement that there be a linked women's support service, and that the mission of the programme was to enhance the safety of women and children that were through working with perpetrators. We get the emergence of Respect here, which is a second tier organisation in 2001, which developed a set of principles and accreditation for programmes in this country. And in 2009, we worked out that there was only 1 in 10 local authorities had a community-based domestic violence prevention programme, which is what we call the work with perpetrators. And last year, Safe Lives estimated that only 1% of perpetrators receive any form of specialist intervention. So there's a big gap here. There's been huge scepticism about engagement with men who use violence and the processes and routes to change. And you can find that scepticism in sociology and criminology about the criminal justice system, but it also applies to these programs that are targeting them. And when we began working on the Mirabelle project that I'm going to talk about in a minute, the research findings on the effect of perpetrator programs was equivocal. Those who used a randomized control trial model found no change, whereas other studies found some change. And part of this is about your methodology. If you've got a randomized control trial and any use of violence after being on a program means you're a failure, then you're likely to find no change. If you're thinking about change in more subtle ways, and that it's about a change in the patterns of your behaviour, then you can find more impact. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that perpetrator programmes have been subject to more intense scrutiny than other layers of our response. We don't decide that refugees, for example, are failures because some women choose to go back to the relationship. So I think we need to have a little think with ourselves about what standards we're placing for judging whether something has an impact or not. And I think one of the unintended consequences of this discomfort with work with perpetrators is that when victim survivors becomes the target of intervention and the expectation of change is on them rather than on the perpetrators. And again, I think that's something we need to reflect on. We've also got policy here that we have to think about. We're a signatory to the Istanbul Convention, on preventing and combating violence against women from the Council of Europe. We've not yet ratified it. We keep being promised that that will happen, but it never does. But one article in that convention actually requires intervention with perpetrators. So this is a policy requirement within that convention. So I want to think about what we know by looking at these 5 forms of intervention or research. So Mirabelle project that I was involved with Nicole Westmoreland, the DRIVE project, PAC, which is Prevent and Change, the way Welsh Women's Aid have integrated perpetrator work into their implementation of change that lasts, and a little bit on the co-location work that DVIP did, because I think they all tell us something different. So Project Mirabelle was a big project that we did with Respect, accredited programs, and we wanted to be innovative in terms of research methods. We wanted to locate these programs within a context, look at how we measured change, and we then had 2 PhD students. One looked at children's perspectives on their fathers being on programs, and one looked at this idea of program integrity. And that we began, we began with a pilot project to think about what should count as success, to do it differently from those randomized controlled trials. And we did 70 interviews with perpetrators, with victim survivors, with workers on programs and funders of programs. And we came up with these 6 measures of success, and they are ordered in the priority that victim survivors gave them. And you can see that no abuse was number 3 in their order of priority. What they first wanted was a relationship based on respect and communication. They wanted what we've called the expanded space for action. So we know that coercive control and violence limits women's freedom, that they are constrained in terms of what they can wear, where they can go, who they can speak to, all of those things. We called that space for action, that their space for action is limited by violence, and what they wanted was for it to be expanded. There's a lot of stuff about parenting, wanting men to understand themselves and their impact on others. And we measured these things through both quantitative and qualitative data. I'm not going to talk a lot about the data, that's just a slide on the data that we collected, and just some headline findings. We followed 100 women over 18 months. And we also had phased interviews with men at time 1 and time 2, and women at time 1 and time 2. And the headline finding was, for the majority, the men who attended, the physical and sexual violence stopped almost completely. So the orange line is the violence, levels of violence before they were on the programme, and the grey line is after. That's a significant change. The less positive finding is that coercive control moved in the same direction, but it remained significant in the lives of about half of the women. So again, we've got the orange line being before being on the programme, and the grey. And we've got things like, did things that scared or intimidated you, belittled or humiliated you in front of other people, insulted you, made you feel bad about yourself, deliberately interfered with or damaged your property, all the things that we are familiar with. And then the other measure to sorry you can't really see this, but it's about their sense of safety. And on the orange here is feeling unsafe, and this is feeling very safe, and you can see how significantly higher that is towards the end of the programme. And we also looked at this idea of expanded space for action. We had a whole lot of things that we thought were restricting where you go, your dress or your appearance, all the things that, the small things, the everyday reality of coercive control. We created a scale to measure this, and you can see again that there's improvement on virtually all of them, and some of them quite significant improvement. So to some extent, we have to say that the programmes worked, that not all of the men, but a significant number of these men changed through the process of being on the programme. And one of the things that raised, that question that raised for me, was about how this happened. And this is where our interviews with the men became really important. And most evaluations don't interview the men. They're kind of regarded, I think, as unreliable witnesses. But actually, we learned a huge amount from their interviews. One of the things that was really obvious looking at their interviews in time 1 and time 2 was how their understanding of violence and abuse had changed. At time 1, they'd be saying, you know, I've never really hit her, I've never done violence to a woman. And at time 2, they were talking about, I understand now that the tone of my voice, how I stand, is a form of intimidation. That's a significant change, I think, and not one that is measured that well by a randomised controlled trial. And we thought that success should be no abuse plus greatly reduced abuse. That actually, if you're going to say it's not effective because there's one incident, when previously there'd be an incident 3 times a week, you're not really thinking about change in the way that that makes a difference in the lived reality of women and children. They use the techniques that they were taught, as a way to take responsibility for their own emotions and their behaviour. They were not very good at understanding their own emotions. And part of what the group work did was enable them to engage with that and understand it better. Lots of them talked about needing time to absorb the content. They needed to understand what they were being challenged with, to reflect on it, and then decide whether they were going to change in relation to it. The group was really, really important to them, seeing themselves reflected in others, but also being challenged by peers rather than just by a facilitator was actually part of the change. And it was really clear that they became men differently. Somebody tells me this isn't about gender. I just want to give them the interviews with these men, because actually that's what they were talking about. They were talking about being a partner and being a father differently. And some of them were actually quite insightful about the change process, that it wasn't a light bulb moment, but a kind of series of sparks, and some of them were set off for some men and some others for others. And we called our final report Steps Towards Change to say that, you know, this isn't a linear process and it's not exactly the same for every man. And this is a guy we've called Kieran, that's not his real name. I just think this is a really interesting way of describing what happened to him. He said it's like the little coin that you drop in and it bounces around, and you are arguing with yourself, and all of a sudden it's at the bottom and you've realised something, which I like as a description of change. So at the end of this, we had challenges to the participant groups and to respect in terms of how they think about this work. They weren't consistent about the amount of work that was done around parenting and the impact on children. And you could see that in how men talked in the interviews. They needed to be more innovative in working on coercive control to be more effective. It was really clear that men who were required to do this as part of child contact processes came in differently than those who still had an investment in wanting to maintain a relationship. And also it was different for the women. You're an ex-partner where there's a child contact issue, and quite often those women had constructed their lives with an absent ex-partner father. And so they didn't have any investment really in their engagement with the programme. Whereas if you're a current partner or you're recently separated, you have a different engagement with, and we thought that this needed to be paid more attention to in how programmes work, and that they need to be commissioned as whole and integrated services. The funding for the support work with women was always much lower than that for working with men, and there was very little investment in support for children whose fathers were on programmes. So just to say a little bit about some of the other approaches that we have, we've got the DRIVE programme, which is a consortium between Safe Lives, Respect and a range of other partners. And it uses a case management system with what are called high harm serial perpetrators, so ones who are unlikely to be accepted onto DVPPs. It's been piloted and commissioned in 12 local authorities, many in England. It has been evaluated and they found a reduction in physical violence in the majority of the participants. Not sure about coercive control. It's mainly works through one-to-one engagement, so not group work, and multi-agency disruption. There's limited information for me on the actual interventions and how the change happens, and that's one of the things I'm most interested in myself. Another project that you may not be aware of that happened in 3 boroughs in London that we recently evaluated, also working with high harm serial perpetrators. And one of the things that was fascinating in this project for me, attending their meetings, observing their meetings, is that they did information sharing in real time. You had the police, children's social care, probation, drug and alcohol misuse projects, women's services, sitting in a room with access to their own databases, sharing information of the latest thing they knew about this particular perpetrator, which enabled them to then find ways in. They could work out, actually, he's not living at that address anymore, he's moved here. He's actually attending a DWP on a Thursday. So you actually built up a way of thinking about where you might intervene and how you might make contact with them. It was implemented in 3 boroughs very differently. Some better buy-in some boroughs than others. some not referring appropriately. So, but one of the things I think the staff did was learn how to work one-to-one with a group of men who were basically disaffected socially, disaffected from institutions. And they developed a very interesting system, I think, of tracking the actions that agencies committed to over time. So their meetings were both new cases and following up on the cases that they had heard previously. It was like MARAC as it was intended. MARAC was intended to focus on perpetrators. You wouldn't know that now, but this was, and all of the participants talked about the benefit to them of being able to focus on perpetrators seriously and concentratedly. Welsh Women's Aid are implementing Change That Lasts, something that originated in Women's Aid England, and they've integrated perpetrator knowledge into their training that they do with professionals. There's a module on knowledge about perpetrators, and the feedback from the trainees, participants, is that this was the bit that they appreciated most. It was knowledge that they'd not previously had access to. They've also got a project called CLEAR, which is an early intervention module, and it's intended to intervene. So not with the serial high harm layer, but actually men who are first coming to the attention of agencies, including the police. So it's intended as an intervention before it becomes an embedded pattern of behaviour, and intended as a motivation to change. And they imagined it as working both one-to-one and in group. Implementation happened 2 months before the first lockdown. So that's really interrupted their ability to pilot this model, but there's some early positive signs for some men, but it's a different target group, if you like, than that for Drive and for Prevent and Change. And then the last thing I want to talk about, because I do think it was very interesting, and I looked up to see whether it's still happening, and I couldn't find any information about it currently, but this was a piece of work developed by DVIP, which is the Perpetrator Programme in London, and they did it in several London boroughs, beginning in Hackney, and it was to locate a skilled perpetrator worker within children's social care. So you co-located a skilled perpetrator worker in a social work department, and it was seen as a way to upskill social workers and to offer case consultation. And it's really clear that one of the reasons social workers don't engage with perpetrators is because they're frightened of them. And so demystifying perpetrators, that they're not monsters, they're actually the guys you're working with anyway, you've just not called them a perpetrator yet, was a really important process. Offering some strategies and ways of working so that you didn't end up as a social worker just focusing on the woman changing, that you could actually hold the men to account as fathers and as partners. So I'm thinking, what does all of this mean in terms of what works? Well, clearly one thing that works is actually to focus on perpetrators, not to let them be hidden in plain sight, to use that term, because actually that's what they often are. To build confidence in workers to be able to engage with them directly, to combine what some of the projects, both Drive and Prevent and Change, talk about the need for some of these men to be stabilised. They might have addiction issues. They might be sofa surfing and homeless. They might have lost their job. They're not going to do positive work around changing themselves unless they themselves are stable. So you need to combine stabilisation work with more challenging content. At the end of Prevent and Change, we suddenly realised that part of what this monitoring of the men by the agencies that they were involved in, keeping them in plain sight, what that was actually doing was the opposite of what you're doing with victim survivors. It was narrowing their space for action. It was saying to them, we've got you in our eye line. We're keeping our eye on you. And that's an important element too. And then offering spaces for reflection and change. I think some men, not all, but some men respond positively to being offered a space which isn't judgmental, which isn't punitive. It's actually an invitation to reflect on their own behaviour and then make the decision whether they're going to change. And then this is my last slide about what we still don't know. I don't think we know why some men choose to change and others don't. And I also think the focus has been primarily on ongoing abuse. And I don't think we know yet how to work with post-separation abuse, including economic abuse. And we don't know how much we could prevent if we knew what worked for perpetrators who belong to marginalised groups. And I'm really glad that Nina might talk about some of her work in that respect. If we really did have early intervention, we're waiting until things have become the pattern of coercive control. If we intervened before it was a pattern, what might be different? We don't know what difference it would make if we really had communities that held men to account. We don't do much work in our communities, and I think we need to do more. And I don't think we know how to enable young people to build respectful relationships from the outset. So those are challenges going forward. Thank you. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Liz. That was really good. Thank you very much, Liz, for that. If anyone has any questions, and I know we do have questions coming in, then if you can add them in the Q&A box, and then we can come to them later. I know there's been some requests of questions, Liz, for links to the research projects, like I think that you were talking about, and I can perhaps add them. Add some links to them at a later date, if that's helpful to people. Oh, sorry, Liz, you're...
Sorry, I'll put them in the chat anyway.
I'll
put them in the Q&A, but then you can do whatever.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Liz. So next up, we have Amber and Lilli. So I will hand over to you to share your screen and to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. This is where we're going to hope that technology doesn't let us down. Okay, where's my technology? It's not coming up, is it? It worked a second ago, it's not working now. No, it's not. Why won't it let me share? Can you see the presentation?
We can.
Brilliant. Okay, over to you, Lilli.
Thank you. My name's Lilli O'Debra. I'm a domestic abuse officer, currently seconded to working with Peterborough City Council within the Family Safeguarding Project, and I'll be delivering this presentation with my colleague.
My name is Amber Slamitis. So just like Lilli, I'm a probation services officer, and I've been seconded as part of the probation service into the Cambridgeshire Family Safeguarding Project, and my area is Fenland.
So we're going to be presenting on working with domestic abuse perpetrators in Cambridgeshire under the Family Safeguarding Project. It's a collaboration between the National Probation Service and Bench CRC, who are the privatised component of the probation service and soon to rejoin under the National Probation Service. So the Family Safeguarding Project is a renewed way of working with cases who are open to children's social care. The term toxic trio has been used to describe three main issues identified as common features in families where harm to children has occurred. These three factors are domestic abuse, mental health, and substance misuse. The Family Safeguarding Project has brought in specialists from these three areas to work alongside social care. We'll start by looking at how probation were involved with domestic abuse perpetrators before and what this looks like now. So before, there was a statutory involvement only. So where the perpetrator has gone through the criminal justice system, been convicted for a domestic abuse offence and received a sentence which requires probation involvement. As this was a statutory requirement, their motivation to engage was not required. And this led to disguised compliance, which was quite common. What would also happen is that the consequences of non-compliance were further punishments, so taken back to breach courts, sentenced with alternative sentences, potential custody, and that sometimes promoted disguised compliance as well to complete the order or licence. With probation previously, there were control measures and enforcement was available. So control measures were available through things such as licence conditions, adding on curfews or tagging, drug testing, and these would end when the sentence come to an end date also. How we work with perpetrators differently now is that perpetrator engagement is voluntary. It's under a collaborative working framework as part of a multidisciplinary team. So as well as the safeguarding model, which includes a social care, domestic abuse officer who works with the perpetrator, domestic abuse practitioner who works with the victim, and substance misuse and mental health services. We also take part in multi-agency meetings, which include police, schools, healthcare, accommodation services and such. Liaison with CRC and MPS is still there. So for any perpetrator that may be known to probation for other offences or for other offences, we would still liaise with probation in information sharing and sharing of risk. It's a more holistic approach and combines motivational interviewing techniques and cognitive behavioural therapies within the intervention. Motivation and accountability are required prior to the referral. So motivational interviewing is used to encourage perpetrators to kind of recognise that their behaviours are unhealthy, unhelpful to their family, and we get that buy-in from them. It allows them to take more accountability in wanting to change. So they're usually at the preparation stage of the cycle of change, and they take more ownership of undergoing treatment and the need to change. We have no means of enforcement, so that's the only difference from before and now.
Right, so I will take you through essentially how the Family Safeguarding Project works on a day-to-day basis. So essentially what Lilli and I do. So the project itself came about in Hertfordshire, and that was over 5 years ago, and that's where it was trailblazing. It has now crossed the county boundaries, and it is being rolled out in Peterborough City and Cambridgeshire County Council. So the team that we have covering both areas comes from Community Rehabilitation Company Bench, as well as the Probation Service. Both services are joining come June, so it's sort of much of muchness in terms of the difference for the time being. In terms of who we engage with, so we engage with both men and women. So we accept referrals for male and female perpetrators, and we accept referrals as well for same-sex couples. Now, the main difference when looking at a number of services out there in comparison to us is the fact that we have absolutely no time limit on engagement. So, for example, if we are engaging with a single mother who happens to be a female perpetrator, which means that she may not be able to commit to regular appointments, it could be that we end up working with her for 9 months, even 12 months in some cases, which is in stark contrast to someone who's on a regular schedule, can commit to weekly appointments, and we can get them through the entire intervention in about 4 to 6 months. So the overall aim of what we do is to help parents who are perpetrators to transition from being parent-centered into child-centered. And in a nutshell, all we're trying to do, to get them to do, is to put their child's needs ahead of their own. Ideally, the desired outcome of the project is to try and keep the families together where possible, so the family remains under the same roof. However, in some cases that's not achievable, at which point we will be looking at keeping the children safe. So in terms of how the service itself functions once we've accepted a referral, so the initial stage is a risk assessment whereby we engage with a perpetrator normally over a period of 6 sessions. And ideally that's a face-to-face session, normally lasting up to 2 hours. We use both quantitative and qualitative tools, so we will rely on spousal assault risk assessment as one of the means to assess risk. We'll do a behaviour inventory with them. We'll ask them to fill in a self-assessment of needs so that we can gauge their individual needs as well. Once the risk assessment sections are completed, a risk assessment is drafted. And that leads into an individualized treatment plan for the perpetrator. So at that point, we will proceed with either a one-to-one intervention or a group intervention, whereby it's a group program. Now, we don't offer any group sessions at all for female perpetrators, so our bespoke one-to-one intervention will always be applicable in the case of a female perpetrator. When it comes to men, the ideal solution is to get them onto the group, purely because engaging with peers and being challenged by them is something that we simply cannot deliver on a one-to-one basis. It will not have the same impact on them. If there are specific individual needs, such as mental health or learning difficulties, for example, we will look at a one-to-one intervention for men as well. So the way the group works, we have weekly sessions. We have 3 modules, as you can see on the slide. So module 1 looks at awareness of abuse. Module 2 looks at emotional control. And module 3 focuses on healthy relationships and impact on children. So overall, we have 4 sessions per module. And then after every module is concluded, we conduct a one-to-one post-module review with them. We are on hand for social care. In terms of offering them informal advice or consultation where they suspect there is domestic abuse behaviours within the family, but the circumstances don't quite qualify for our engagement. All of our engagement with a perpetrator is then reported back to the multidisciplinary team. We also attend child in need and child protection meetings and feed into those, as well as the conferences. And we attend case supervisions within social care. to make sure that the case is headed in the right direction. Where the family have been subjected to legal proceedings and where they are at the public law outline stage, we will be submitting statements to court to explain what work we have actually engaged in with the perpetrator. Back to you.
Sorry, I should mention that the differences with before and now, one of the main differences is the pathways. So probation, their pathway of working with domestic abuse perpetrators is through the courts and statutory intervention. Our pathway as DAOs with the Family Safeguarding Project are referrals which come in from police due to domestic abuse call-outs, disclosures from victims, and concerns from professionals that are working with the family. So they don't need to have a conviction to undergo the domestic abuse perpetrator work with DAOs. So it's more preventative and early intervention.
Sorry, I'll just like Lilli, just to say on the group program, we haven't been stopped by COVID, and we have actually converted our entire group program into virtual sessions, and we are continuing to deliver virtually despite the pandemic for the time being.
So if we have a look at some quantitative outcomes, as you can see, Bench conducted a review of 118 cases which received treatment over the last 12 months. There was a 67% reduction in the risk level, meaning that cases have not remained at child protection and have de-escalated to either child in need or resulted in case closures. Where the risk has escalated or increased in a small portion of cases, as you will hear in the case studies later, some of the cases, the risk has been underestimated when the referral was made. So when the domestic abuse officer has commenced their intervention, they have a probation background and are skilled in assessing risk. When they've become involved, they have assessed the risk to be greater than previously thought by social care, and that's through their professional curiosity, looking at the call-outs, developing discrepancies, and assessing the risk that the perpetrator holds. So that has influenced some of the risk level increase. We also conducted a review of 118 cases with relation to domestic abuse call-outs and allegations prior to treatment. So prior to treatment, out of the 118 cases, there were 289 call-outs and allegations. And post-treatment, there were 30 domestic abuse call-outs and allegations from those 118 cases. What this shows is that post-treatment, the call-outs have decreased by 259 call-outs. This means there's been 259 less domestic abuse incidents, which have required 259 less police call-outs, and therefore 259 less incidents of domestic abuse that have been witnessed by children in the home. So this analysis suggests that there has been a positive outcome for families and communities of this intervention by the Safeguarding Project. So if we look at some case studies now, so I've worked with a family that had a same-sex relationship. Partner A was the biological mother and partner B was a step-parent. Social care had referred both parents via the perpetrator route. As we started to undertake the assessment, we found that there were lots of complexities with the case. So parent A had 2 previous children who had been adopted. They'd undergone trauma from sexual abuse in past relationships. Parent B had childhood trauma from sexual and physical abuse. There were mental health concerns and there was a diagnosis of emotional personality disorder. Partner B was also isolated and had limited supports from family and friends due to cultural issues and the cultural views of same-sex relationships. So these complexities combined led to a really unhealthy codependency between the couple. When the domestic abuse officers commenced work with partner A responded well. She started to understand safeguarding concerns and the experience that children may be witnessing through the domestic abuse taking place in the home. She began to take more of a child-centred approach. Now, what we realised working with both parents at the same time was that partner B, this started to have a negative impact on partner B. Partner B started having feelings of jealousy and insecurity. They were receiving less attention from partner A. The abuse increased to emotional abuse, making partner A feel guilty, threats of suicide, actual self-harm, and emotional and coercive abuse through withholding affection. This was picked up quite early on due to the professional involvement. We worked with partner A and B to increase awareness of the different types of domestic abuse. So not just the physical, but the emotional, the psychological, the coercive control. They had an increased understanding of power and control and how that can impact the relationship, and recognise patterns in the relationship that they were bringing. So partner B started to accept that actually their abuse was increasing. They didn't recognise that what they were doing constituted as coercive control. They were both supported with bespoke one-to-one treatment. So this included one-to-one techniques to support positive communication, managing conflict situations, and child-centred parenting, and also the impact of domestic abuse on children. We also work collaboratively with other agencies to increase their individual support needs. So signposting to relevant agencies such as Women's Centre, Mental Health Services and Trauma Counselling. The case concluded with both engaging with support services, both accepting that the relationship was unhealthy and bringing it to an end. They were both self-sufficient with the support that they had, but they maintained a strong child-centred relationship. And the conclusion was the child remained with biological mum.
So I've picked up 2 case studies just to add a little more variety in. So case study number 2, mixed sex couple. They were having their first child together. Both had children from their previous relationships, and those children were either in care or under special guardianship orders with the family members. So social care actually referred Dad in for his abusive behaviours. Having looked at the referral, we were not that convinced that was indeed the case. So the decision was made to do something very bespoke, which is to have back-to-back, face-to-face interviews with both mum and dad in this case. And what that showed was essentially that Dad was responding to sustained emotional and psychological abuse that mum was exposing him to. So the perpetrator in that case was actually mum. The reason I've sort of picked up the case study is just to really say that these stereotypes where males are deemed to be perpetrators almost at the outset are still quite prevalent. And we are trying to educate social care in assessing the situation on its merits, as I believe they could have done in this case. The case was quite complex in that Dad has quite a considerable disability. Both mum and dad suffer with mental health. But what then came to light was that whilst they both maintain their separate accommodation, Dad's been having housing issues for over a decade that remained unresolved. And we were coming to a point where Dad's reliance on support from mum for a hot shower and washing and things like that became ever increasing. So from a risk perspective, the concern was that that over-reliance on support will lead to conflict and in turn to escalation of risk. So in this case, we reached out to the housing provider and asked them to rectify the situation. The outcome of the case was that we've been able to step down the case from child protection to child in need. And the last case study that we've picked was, again, a mixed sex couple. They've got 2 children together, mum raising children from a previous relationship, social care with her dad in. What was very interesting with this case is that we had absolutely no police intelligence on any domestic abuse call-outs, and we had no domestic abuse convictions. So this is really a case of very, very early intervention. And the case has only come about because of a professional hunch that was had by a couple of different professionals engaging with the family. As I proceeded to engage with that, it became apparent that he's actually a very high-risk individual. So keeping the family together was not an option here. And what the social care are now looking at is making sure that when dad does have contact with the children, it's in a contact centre and it's actually supervised by someone qualified to do so. So there we're trying just to circumvent the risk to children, but we can't keep the family together.
And lastly, we just wanted to finish off with a slide of sample testimonials from service users who have been through the end-to-end process of the family safeguarding project under the domestic abuse officers. So starting from the risk assessment all the way through to group intervention. And as you can see, they're quite positive. They've mentioned that much of the course would be very suited to couples, even before they find themselves in trouble. The families they feel that the families are perfect following intervention and that the children are happy. But one testimony that isn't there, which one had from somebody that completed the group programme, he was very hesitant to attend the group intervention initially, but at the end his testimonial said that he'd actually increased his understanding about abusive behaviours, about coercive control, and not just the physical violence. And he felt that this should be something that's taught to children at school about what healthy relationships look like, what abusive behaviours are, to kind of stem the continued cycle of domestic abuse within families. And
that's it from us.
The end of
so, yeah, thank you for listening and giving us a chance to present.
That's great. Thank you both very much.
Have I stopped sharing?
Yes.
No.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. Thank you. Finally, we've got Nina, who is going to speak from the Freedom Programme and about the work she does with the Freedom Programme and their men's project. So I'll hand over to Nina. Thank you.
Oh, Susie, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Brilliant. I'm going to have to apologise from the onset and say I don't have any presentation slides. Everyone else's was so fancy and brilliant. So you'll just have to listen to me, I'm afraid. The Freedom Programme started 25 years ago. Pat Craven, who wrote it, created it, was a probation officer. And she found that she was working with men, and she found that she was, without realising, colluding with them and actually putting women's lives in danger. So when she wrote the Freedom Programme, it was for women. And she started off working with women from the Probation Service as well, and found that a lot of them had been convicted, and because previously they had encountered domestic abuse as well. The men's programme was written in 2013, and so that's been running for quite a long time. That's been running with Pat Craven and Christine Ashton. And before our COVID limitations, it was run over weekends. So it was run over 2 days, where you needed a certain number of men to make it work, because it's based on your peers and what your peer group is saying. I got involved from last year when the programme went onto Zoom. And so now it's available to men. It was available to men worldwide anyway, but they had to travel to come into the UK. And now men can access it just via Zoom. So the men's programme, if you think about the women who are experiencing domestic abuse, when they come on the Freedom Programme, you'll find that they come from all areas of life. So they have, you know, their differences in class, social backgrounds, their education level. And so the men who have been abusing them also come from, you know, a whole variety of backgrounds as well. When the men first come on, they actually purchase an online course. So the online course is very, very cheap. It's almost free. It's £12. And then they have an option of attending a Zoom session, which will have other men on it as well. And it's run with around 15 men, because there's lots of interaction with everybody that's there. It's based on 8 personas that we look at, and these are the same personas of men that we look at on the Women's Freedom Programme. So I'll run through them quickly. Don't worry about writing any of these down if anybody wanted to, because if you Google the Freedom Programme, all this information comes up on the home page. And then there are more tabs that you can go into for more information. So the 8 personas that we look at are the bully, the jailer, the head worker, the persuader, the liar, the bad fiver, king of the castle, and the sexual controller. And under each of those personas, we start to look at the tactics that are used to control women, to keep us in place. We also, on every session, as well as looking at each of these personas, so one week we'll be looking at the bully, the next week we'll be looking at the jailer. We look at the complete opposite of that persona as well, and we look at the positive. So for example, when we're looking at the bully, we're also, right at the end of the session, we'll look at the opposite, which is the friend. And when we're looking at the jailer, for example, and his tactics about how he keeps us isolated, we'll also look at the complete opposite, who is the liberator, who will encourage us to have, you know, our own hobbies, for example. So we run this, it runs over 12 weeks, although there are only 8 personas. We run it over 12 weeks because a couple of them run over 2 weeks. And for example, one of them is the effects of domestic abuse on children, and that goes on for a couple of weeks. The question, Susie, that you originally posed to all of us was why we need to work with perpetrators and what we know about what works. And I remember Professor Kelly saying it right at the beginning as well, that the blame seems to lie with women, the responsibility seems to be on us. So when social workers come in and the plan is made out, it's all for mum. And if it's for dad, it will usually be something that they need to do together. So perhaps it's a parenting program. And that puts a lot of responsibility on us. But it also shows victim blaming, that, you know, it must be my fault. So if I've been asked to go on the Freedom Programme, that means it, you know, a lot of this stuff is to do with me, and I need to change my behaviour, and then everything will be okay. So this is why it's important that we have a men's freedom programme, so that men are accountable for their own behaviour. It's quite grassroots, so it doesn't have the same constraints as some of the other organisations have. When men come onto it, some of them are referred onto it either via the Probation Service or court ordered or CAFCAS, for example. But men can come on this themselves as well, so they can self-refer. And when it's advertised, it's not advertised for perpetrators. It's a men's freedom programme, and Pat Craven says, and she usually says this on a Friday on Twitter, for men who want to stop being arseholes. For men who want to stop being arseholes. And then, of course, over the weekend, everybody else will get all the tweets saying, you know, we're not arseholes, and how dare you've called us arseholes. But it is for men who want to be better men. So men can self-refer. When they come on it, and I'm now on my 3rd programme, so each one is 12 weeks. When men come on, I don't know anybody's background. All that is dealt with the administration side of things. And at the moment, an organisation, a brilliant organisation in Scotland called No Fiat, and I'll put the information up in chat later. They will take all the referrals. So they will find out if it's a probation service or it's a court order, for example. But when men come onto the group, there is no judgment. Everyone on there, I don't know about anyone's background or why they're there even. I'm there to go through the programme, which is split into sections, which I'll go over in a minute. And it's up to them whether they change, because we can't tell if they've changed. I think this is something that Pat found, that when she felt that she had colluded with a lot of men, is because they knew what to say to us, because they have particular beliefs about women. And so they knew what to say in order for us, you know, to write a report. The only people who will ever know really if the men have changed are the women who are their partners. They will see if there's been any changes in behaviour, any changes in tactics. And right at the end, I will let you know what the figures have been for us of any change that's been made. So if you imagine now a chap decides he's going to come on the Men's Freedom Programme, he goes online, he pays his £12, and now he has access to an online course, which it's up to him what pace he wants to complete it at. So if he's working, for example, he can do it in the evenings. Or he might find that he wants to do it week by week. And after he finishes each week, he then comes on to our Zoom group. And on our Zoom group, we will go over the online program, but we will do it practically. So that's the practical side of things. When he comes on, most of the sessions, almost all of the sessions, follow the same format. And they are that we go over the tactics that are used. So for example, if we're looking at the bully one week, we'll look at the tactics that are used by the bully. Then we'll look at the beliefs of the bully. Then we'll look at how those beliefs are reinforced and where they came from originally. Then we change it and we look at how women are affected by those tactics and that behaviour. And right at the end, we end with a complete positive, and we end with, in this particular case where it's the bully, we'll end with a friend. And we'll look at, well, what does the friend do? What are his behaviours? When men on the group are responding, and each person has to respond, each person has to cooperate and be part of the group, they will respond in the first person. So they will say, if we're looking at tactics and we're looking at the bully, they will say, I stare at her. I puff my body up when I walk past her. I slam doors. And so they're taking responsibility right from the beginning. Sometimes, you know, men will say, oh, well, that's not me. And I need to remind them again that they're in role. You know, we're not saying that this is what you do, you're in role. And this is that it creates a really safe environment where they're not going to be judged, but also they feel able to then open up a little bit more. You can tell when somebody has just been reading the online information and they're just regurgitating what they've read. And you can see when people are using completely different tactics and telling you, you know, in role what they've done. Then when we look at beliefs, and again, I'll just use the example of the bully, he may say, well, I believe I'm better than her. And of course, the men are in role, and, you know, you'll say, well, you know, become the bully. What do you believe? And so you may go around and you just go, oh, well, you know, it's fucking stupid. And this is what women are hearing. So we, you know, as women who are, you know, subjected to abuse, we will hear swearing. We will hear absolutely the most disgusting, vile language being used against us. So when we're on the Freedom Programme, none of that is watered down. They get to hear it. So when we look at how these beliefs have been reinforced, I can give you an example of one that I use quite regularly, and I'll say, you know, well, you know, when I'm watching football and I'm in the role of a dominator, of a perpetrator, of a man who's abusive, and I'll say, well, I was watching that football, and, you know, that manager, when that woman who's supposedly a doctor went up onto the pitch because that footballer was injured. I mean, I don't know how she got that fucking job anyway. You know, she probably shagged someone to get that job. I don't think she's a real doctor anyway. And it's that sort of language. So we're getting them to really think about their language and be authentic. You know, how are these beliefs reinforced? Because men will speak quite differently where they're in a group, and they'll water it down perhaps when they're with women. And that's what we're taking away when we're on the Freedom Programme. We'll say, you know, we've heard this all before, nothing's going to get watered down. Speak in the role of a dominator, and what does he believe? When we change it and then go around the group and say, how am I as a woman affected by these tactics? That's giving them an opportunity to see it completely from somebody else's eyes. So on this particular session as the bully, somebody may say, I'm constantly fearful. I feel humiliated. I'm walking on eggshells because I don't know when he's going to lash out, when he's going to have a go at me. The minute I hear the key in the door, I'm petrified. So they have to go around and speak from that point of view. When we do the session on the effects on children, they speak from the point of view of children, because they'll be saying, this is how I'm affected. And we break that down as well, even further to different age groups. So they will talk from the voice of an unborn child, they'll talk from the voice of a newborn baby, or the voice of a pregnant mum. Then they'll talk from the voice of a 5-year-old, and that really gets them to understand what a 5-year-old, you know, what do they hear, what do they see, how do they feel? And then we'll go on to the teenager. So the men really are held accountable, and to really have a look at themselves and to really look at their beliefs. On the very first session, we look at beliefs. Pat cited it constantly in a book called Living with the Dominator, which is used on the Freedom Programme. And she explains in that how our beliefs are the engines that drive all our actions. So if I believe that my partner is a stupid slag, then all my actions are going to be around that. And we do a belief exercise on the very first week. And I'm just going to just demonstrate with one of the questions that we ask. So everybody is on Zoom, and we'll say, if you agree with the following statement, please raise your hand. The question is, do I believe it is important to keep the air we breathe clean? And, you know, almost everybody will put their hand up. And you go, that's fine. Everyone can put their hand down. And the next question is, do I drive a car or use public transport or accept lifts in, you know, in a car? And then as the hands are going up, you can almost see that people are starting to realize that they're completely two conflicting, you know, they're completely conflicting. And we do a series, we go through more exercises like that. And by the end, we explain that, well, can you see that, you know, when you have completely conflicting beliefs like this, and we try and rationalize it, but it's actually known as cognitive dissonance. So we've already let them know that, you know, you might be saying, well, I don't hit women unless she does this. So they've already got two conflicting beliefs around that. We don't write any reports for any organisations. And that's because if we were writing a report, what would that report say? It's only our experience. Again, the only person that will really know if there's any change will be his partner. If we write a report, we could actually endanger her life. So I could write, yes, he's engaging. Well, he's engaging because he has to engage. That's part of this chap being on the Freedom Programme. If he's not engaging, then he can't take part. Women will only know if he's changed because his behaviour will change. It works because it's a peer group, just as the Women's Freedom Programme works in the same way. If you think of teenage boys, or even young children, even younger boys, if you go back to, they won't listen so much to their parents as they will to their peer group. So, you know, if I'm talking to my child, and I'm saying, please don't do this, it's bad for you. You know, he's not going to listen to me until one of his friends says, oh my God, this happened to me, I'm not doing that ever again. And this works in the same way. So the men are on there, they're seeing that there's such a variety of other men on there. And this is why it seems to work. Men are more worried about other men and what they're thinking of them, certainly much more than what women are going to think of them, or what, you know, if they're on the group of what I think of them, they don't really care what I think of them, but they are, you know, they're more concerned about what the other men on the group will think of them. One of the the original question, Susie, was, and the second part of it was what we know about what works. Pat found that approximately, on average, 6 out of 10 of the men that were on the programme, the women would feed back, their partners would feed back, because at the same time, their female partners will go on a women's freedom programme. So they will know exactly what the men are also doing. That way, there is no space for anyone to come back and say, you know what, I've been on the freedom programme and it's all your bloody fault, because that's what I've learned, that it's all your fault. If you didn't nag so much, I wouldn't do that. But if a woman is also doing the freedom programme at the same time as her partner is, they're actually doing the same thing. So that way, if a woman then decides that, you know what, he's on this and he's not changing, his behaviour isn't changing, and I did want to give him one last chance, you know, that almost clarifies for her whether there is any room for change at all. I wanted to read out to you, if I may. It's with permission, but I'll leave out all the names. Somebody came onto the men's freedom programme, and as I read part of his response when it ended, it'll explain what his journey was, what he thought when he first came on. Now, I don't know whether he was asked to be on the freedom programme, whether he was sent via a court order. I imagine he was with the content. But he says, "Hi, I feel like the first few weeks of the course, I was still under the illusion that this wouldn't benefit me, and I was outspoken at some points. I wouldn't say I opposed being referred to the course, but I also wouldn't say I was open-minded enough in the beginning. I've learned a lot about myself and people that I have often surrounded myself with. I do want to do the course again, for the simple fact that I feel like I missed key information at some points, for my sheer lack of self-responsibility. You realise how relevant a lot of the information is, and how I placed a lot of my insecurities in past relationships to cover for my own shortcomings. This isn't something I have enjoyed at all times, but I do feel like I'm becoming a better person with the knowledge I now have from the course. Thank you for everything to yourself and Nina. I appreciate it. I've improved. I'm more confident and realizing I can't control things out of my range, but only myself, and to bring my daughter up to never be like her parents have been in the past." So that was somebody who came on originally, who, you know, I felt that didn't want to be there. And by, you know, week 7, week 8 was really engaging. So we know it does work. It's an over 50%, you know, success rate to it. There is the same model is used for teenagers, which is called How Hard Can It Be? And again, it wouldn't be mixing, you know, between 13 to 19. It would just be in smaller groups with young people in their own age category. But it's important because it lets men understand where their beliefs have come from, and they get to talk about it in role. None of the men on the group are ever allowed to talk about their own cases. They're never allowed to discuss their own experiences or feelings. Everything is done via being in role. And that's the safest way they can say what they want to say, but it's extremely structured. It's extremely clever. I always think that when I did my degree, I didn't pick up any of this thing around behaviour, but it really does come down to beliefs. So I think when, as younger, if we can target children in primary school, secondary school, that's when the beliefs are setting in. And for men who are older, they will change if they want to change. It depends what their motive is for changing. If it's to see their children, if it's to be better men because they've experienced abuse within, you know, their own homes, and that's the only way they've ever known how to live. And this is an alternative. We're giving them information about, you don't have to be perfect, but you just have to be a decent human being. And these are the behaviours of a decent human being compared to those of a dominator. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thank you, Nina. I think those three presentations were really interesting, in part because actually I think they come from the different things come from slightly different approaches to dealing with domestic violence and perpetrators, which definitely in social work has been highlighted consistently, as Liz identified, but also through things like Ofsted and through serious case reviews, that social work does struggle to engage with perpetrators of domestic violence. So I think there's lots of scope there in terms of things to think about how social workers should engage or could engage with domestic violence perpetrators. We do have quite a few questions, so I will, in the last half hour, we'll try and get through as many as we can. So I think somebody had asked, and I think it's probably targeted predominantly at Liz, but Nina and Amber and Lilli might also have views on it. But the question was, what were your views on risk assessment?
Yeah. Okay. My basic starting point is that I think most risk assessment misunderstands who is at risk and who is the risk. And so we're doing risk assessment with women when they're the ones at risk, rather than with and about the men who are the risk. So that's my conceptual critique of it. I also have a practical critique of it, which is that it's not very effective in enabling us to understand who might be most at risk of, let's take the extreme, homicide, which is where it began. It began as a way to, risk assessment in domestic violence began as a way to try and reduce domestic violence homicide. And actually, if you look at the research on domestic violence homicides, where there was a risk assessment, most of them were assessed as medium or low risk. So actually, it's not effective in enabling us to identify that group. And what tends to happen is that workers are encouraged to rely on it for that reason and not listen in as much as they should do to the perspectives of the survivors. And they're the ones who actually know that something's changed in the behaviour that is making them more fearful. But it might not be anything that features strongly on the DASH risk assessment. And lots of abusers have very bespoke strategies. They're specific to their partner and to their situation. So you're not necessarily going to see it on a checklist. And I think it underplays professional judgment, but also relational engagement with survivors. You need to be engaging with the person who you're working with. And I worry that risk assessment becomes a barrier rather than an enabler. I could say more, but I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you, Liz. No, and I think that's really interesting, actually, just to respond to one of the things you said about perpetrators developing bespoke ways. I know we at the University of Wolverhampton, myself, Elaine Arnold and Mahua Kanjil, we're doing some research on how service providers have managed domestic violence during COVID. And one of the things that's come up in that research is that actually some perpetrators have used some of the COVID restrictions in order to perpetrate domestic or coercive control against their sort of partners. So I think that sort of sprung into my mind when you said that they have bespoke ways of actually sort of being perpetrators. And I think you're right. That's a really important thing to hold on to, that actually, in a sense, that sort of abuse is going to be that they will find their individual ways, and actually any assessment needs to unpick those very particular ways of being abusive and how that domestic violence is sort of playing out in that particular household or relationship or family.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Can I just add to that? So in terms of the risk assessments that we undertake, they come from a place of kind of really trying to understand from the perpetrator's perspective of why the abuse is occurring. So in order to treat someone, we need to kind of understand how and why the abuse is occurring. We look at incidents of abuse and the triggers, the thoughts, feelings that then influence their behaviour. Our risk assessment also incorporates a section where it talks about the perpetrator and what their expectations are from the intervention. So they almost kind of feed into their own risk assessment about what they think the problem areas are and what they need assistance with. We use like GAM, the general aggression model. So that looks at kind of the learning loop of how somebody uses abusive behaviours to make gains, and how that learning loop can then impact continued abusive behaviours within their relationship. And we do that at the risk assessment stage as well. So it's creating that awareness of why the abuse is perpetrated and what those underlying thoughts, feelings and beliefs are that kind of perpetuate that abuse in a continuous cycle. And then, like I said, we ask their views on what they feel the intervention needs to target for them and what their hopes are for the intervention. So we include that in our risk assessment, and we include that when we're doing the recommendation for intervention as well, what they feel they need assistance with and how our intervention can help with that. So it really does kind of, it's collaborative with the perpetrator. So again, they feel that they have ownership of where this intervention is heading for them and their families.
Sorry, muted. That's really helpful. Thank you. Nina, did you want to add anything to risk assessment?
I probably wouldn't be able to say anything on this because I don't do any risk assessments. I'm sort of like the last place that everyone would come to, and all the risk assessment has already been done beforehand.
That's great, thank you. So the next question that I was going to, is, someone's asked in the questions, in research for domestic violence, has it indicated that denial is a barrier to change? And he just, this person just wondered, as the prerequisite for family support program, the family support program, is it motivated by acceptance? So I think that what they're trying to say is, do you have to accept that you are a sort of perpetrator, or you have got a problem to be accepted onto the program? So I'm guessing that's directed at Amber and Lilli.
Yeah, so what we're calling this is sort of the golden nuggets, really, where we get some buy-in from the perpetrator of what abusive behaviours they themselves acknowledge. As long as we've got that, it's a bit of a case of we can reel them in, but we will not accept any referral where there is a blanket denial. because that prohibits us from having any challenge-based intervention. At that point, the actual intervention is pointless, because it will be all about disguised compliance. So we'd be wasting their time, hours, and it just wouldn't lead anywhere. I don't know if you...
Yeah, if they're not taking accountability, because again, this is about kind of the experiences of the family, the impact on the victim, the impact on the child. If they are denying abusive behaviours, then there's no room for change or kind of increase of awareness.
So it's exactly like, you know, Nina said, do you want to stop being an arsehole? And if the answer to that is I'm not an arsehole, then we've got nowhere to go.
Yeah, no, that's
work
helpful.
that some organisations do that they call motivational work. So you can't go on one of the programmes if you're absolutely denying that there's any kind of problem whatsoever. But if through some one-to-one work you can begin to accept that maybe there might be a problem with some of your behaviour, then that creates a space where some work can begin to happen.
And I think that's why actually in social work particularly, and I'm thinking, I mean, my background is children's social work, so predominantly safeguarding work. Actually, you're not in a position to say, whilst some projects, some services are in a position where they can say we're not going to work with them. Actually, quite often in children's you have no choice. So I think that is true in terms of in social work terms. Sometimes what we need, I think. And I think sometimes the area of work often only provides us one or two interventions. We need to be more creative about actually seeing how you get the person to the point of a particular type of intervention. So you may only have access to one or two perpetrator programs, or even less in some cases, but actually that there is a big chunk of work before that, like you say, Liz, is based on things like motivational work, which is around working to help people to understand that there is a problem. And that's pretty much a key aspect of a lot of children's social work, because to be fair, a lot of people don't accept, they definitely don't share the same view as the social worker in terms of what the problems are. So I think it's that's probably a big bit of social work that we don't talk enough about, is actually what do you do with somebody when they say, what are you talking about? I've got a problem. And that actually, what do you do then? So Nina, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, this is really interesting when, because I don't know, I will have a register of who to expect every week, and not everybody will turn up, and they'll have their own reasons, which again, I don't need to know why they're not turning up. But you'll see who, right from the beginning, who there is a struggle, with who wants to gain power, because one of the biggest beliefs is, what are two women doing here telling me how about domestic, well, not domestic abuse, but who does she think she is? That's what's probably running through some men's minds. So you'll see that they may start off, one or two people have in the past said, it's actually not me, and they will shrink themselves, and their voice will be very timid, and then I'll have to remind them very quickly that we're not here to talk about any individuals. We have to just respond in role. So you can already start to see who feels that they shouldn't be there, and that's not taking responsibility at all, because even from the onset, we're not saying that anybody here is a dominator or anybody here is a perpetrator. It's everyone's here to learn about these tactics and behaviors and the effect that these have on women and children. So yeah, you can see quite quickly who feels that they shouldn't be there.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. A question that I think will be interesting for all of you to sort of have a respond to, because I think it's on the toxic trio, which is a concept that floats around social work quite a lot. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think it emerged out of serious case reviews and the way that the sort of observation that actually domestic violence often coexisted with mental health problems and substance misuse problems. But yeah, the question is, the toxic trio has recently been slammed for lack of real evidence. Do you have something to support the use of toxic trio within work? Or, I mean, basically, I suppose if people could talk about what their views are on the toxic trio. Does anyone want to go first, or?
I'll go first as a skeptic.
Yeah, oh, you're a skeptic, yeah.
Well, not that I don't think that those things can be present. I just think we're constantly grasping at oversimplifications to help us make sense of things, because we're not anymore given space to think and reflect and take time to do the more complex stuff. And those things, you know, if we take those as the framework, then what about the invisible white middle class men again, who don't have mental health problems, who aren't addicted, but probably drink their wine with their dinner and whatever, like most people who can afford to. And you know, you can have domestic abuse where neither mental health nor substance misuse is present. And it can be as harmful and damaging for women and children as when it is present. It's that the cases where you've got that constellation are possibly the ones that you're most likely to see in social work, because they'll come through multiple routes and so they land on your desk. But actually there's a whole host of cases that you never get to see within children's social care, that some of which may have those components, but a lot of which won't.
No, that's interesting. So it's really an expression of the complexity of the cases that are being seen, rather than as a reflection of actually the domestic, the sort of pattern of domestic violence within the society. So yeah, Amber and Lily, do you want to speak about?
Yeah, I think within the safeguarding project, it's not a combination of all three have to be present to increase significant harm to children. So if domestic abuse is the only factor present, that's still significant harm. If there are substance misuse issues, we have those specialists under that one umbrella. It just makes the interagency collaborative information sharing a lot easier, because serious further case reviews, I think one of the main things is that lack of information sharing between agencies. So it allows that to take place. So I'm not saying that all three have to be present. They can be they individual factors as well. But it allows us to information share in a multi-agency way a lot better, I think, under the project.
Yeah, and I think it's actually quite likely, I suppose, in a probation service that you are going to get a real dominance of those sorts of cases, actually, because I'm guessing that actually equally that lots of men are convicted of violence. That's one of the things men do get convicted of, and that lots of violence is connected with particularly alcohol misuse, but also some drug misuse. And so I suppose those things are going to coexist. There's a sort of just a likelihood that they are going to be present together, those things. I suppose it's what it tells us. We've got to be mindful, I suppose, about what it tells us, particularly in terms of assessment terms.
In assessment terms, I think, you know, essentially it is just a term. It's just a shortcut, I think, that we try to use as signposts for saying this is volatile. You know, you need to really keep your eyes peeled. Because when you have that mix, the situation could become explosive at any point. You need then very little to tip the balance. So I think it's really, you know, it's much more once someone says toxic trio, you right away know what you mean. So it's a shortcut in terminology rather than, I think, my chels. I don't think it's indicative of if you've got that, you'll have DV. I think I would disagree with that.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you. And Nina?
Yeah, I've got quite a strong view on it. I think it's quite prejudicial because, just like Liz said, it will be used towards particular families, and then there will be so many other families that will just, you know, go under the radar. And domestic abuse affects everybody. So and we know this from the Freedom Programme. So when I used to co-facilitate before the COVID rules, women, I remember one woman who, on a particular group, who hadn't left school. You know, she was a young mum, and there was a woman on the same group who had a PhD. And so their partners and their experience of domestic abuse, I imagine that the younger girl would have, you know, had this particular term would have been used for her, but not for the woman who had the PhD. So I think it can be, I think it's quite a red herring.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I was sorry to bring up your Twitter feed again, Liz, but I was you were talking on Twitter, I think either this week or late last week, about the importance of teaching about domestic violence and sexual violence, I think, and that being taught in a detailed way in courses like social work. And I think perhaps that there is a difference between the types of people that come, that sort of particular agencies come across, and the nature of the sort of problems that are presented. So if you are a children's social worker, you really are only going to come across the demographic of women who and children and perpetrators who have children. And if you're a probation officer, you're likely to come across that demographic who get caught and convicted. But actually, perhaps what you're talking about, Nina, is a programme which probably incorporates and brings in a much broader range of people who experience domestic violence, which again brings me back to, I think, the point you were making on Twitter, Liz, is that there's actually a need to understand domestic violence, not just it within the context of the agency that you might be working within.
And can I say, sorry, Susie, I was also going to say, I think it brings bias. So I think if we're looking at a situation, thinking about the toxic trio, we would have a bias within us as soon as we would see a family.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you about that, Nina. What I was trying to say was that some of us have been arguing for a long time that not just domestic violence, but violence against women and children should be a core topic in all professional qualification degrees, including being a dentist, including, you know, all professionals who are likely to encounter the signs, if you like, of this, and in relation to both victims and perpetrators and children, should get education on this. And I constantly meet social workers in London, not in the last year and a half, but before that, who say to me, your lecture was the one thing we had on domestic violence on our social work training course, and it's 50% of my caseload. That's wrong. We're not equipping people to do their job effectively and in a way that makes them feel that they've been useful, because we're not giving them the basic foundations. And it shouldn't be reliant on you getting in-service training from your particular local authority. It should be absolutely central to what we're doing. And I would include sexual violence and sexual abuse in that. You know, it's not an accident that since it stopped being part of the core curriculum for social work, that the proportion of children who are recorded as being in need in relation to sexual abuse has dropped massively. We've got no evidence that sexual abuse has reduced, but its identification and working with it in a case has definitely reduced.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is definitely true. I mean, I looked at the figures for domestic violence in terms of the most recent government statistics from the Children in Need census that's done every year. And I think it was 50.8% of all sort of single assessments undertaken by social workers in children's departments identified domestic abuse as an issue within that assessment. So I mean, absolutely, it is 50% of all work in children's social care. So I think it is a key issue, and I think one that it does need a higher prevalence, which is in part why we wanted to do these webinars. So we've got 10 minutes, so I'll pick out one more question. I'm really sorry, there's loads of questions, but they're we're not going to have time to answer them all. So one, which again, another question that I think is really interesting as a question is, if both partners are displaying domestic abuse towards each other, is there support as a couple as well as individuals, and what would work best? So I think just generally in terms of what are your thoughts on working with cases where there is domestic violence going in both directions?
So we pick up what we call perpetrator victims, which if we do have a couple of a perpetrator victim scenario, if there is genuine motivation for changing, for having a healthy relationship, we're quite happy to work with both and engage with both. The engagement will be individual. So the engagement will be with each of them separately. We don't work with them as a couple, so we don't deliver a couples intervention, if you like. And what we would be looking to do, we've got one referral currently in exactly along the same lines. Both are perpetrator victims, and it is a high risk case. So in that case, we will have different members of team working with mum and dad separately, for the simple reason that as part of the multidisciplinary team, we feed into the meetings. And what we don't want to do is, when we attend those meetings, is to make either party feel as if we're taking sides, because that would completely destroy any therapeutic relationship we've built up with either party. So yes, we do pick those up. Yes, we work with them. We just make adjustments, but no, we do not deliver couples intervention. Work with them will be conducted separately. At the end of the risk assessment, obviously, if mum's a female in relationship, it will be a one-to-one intervention. Dad, if possible, will proceed to group. So I hope that sort of, does that cover? Yeah. What we do?
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
I think this is a conceptual thing. I define domestic violence or intimate partner violence, whatever we want to call it, coercive control, as a pattern of power and control. So it's one directional. It's that one partner is trying to maintain, establish power and control over the other. That's what I define as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I'm not disputing that there aren't couples where there's mutual violence and abuse going on, but I don't define that in my framing as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I think it's a different dynamic.
Yeah, I think there's I'm trying to think, sorry, just the name of the Michael Johnson wrote a book, didn't he, on the typology of domestic violence, and in that book he defines different types of domestic violence in I suppose in a similar way, I'm guessing, to what you're saying, Liz, which is that there's a type of domestic violence which is about power and control, and then there is some relationships that contain violence, and that they are quite different types of relationships.
He calls that common couple violence, and I think that's a bit and I didn't use that term deliberately. He calls what most people understand as domestic violence domestic terrorism.
Yes, he does. Yes,
that's what he calls it.
Yeah, his book is called, isn't it, A Typology of Domestic Violence, Intimate Terrorism and Violent Resistance. So yeah. Nina.
I was going to say, if you imagine that the partners both arrive to their session, and mum, mum has had extra things that she's been dealing with as maybe the main child carer, and she's been subjected to abusive tactics before she gets there. The people that are in the room are only going to see what's presented to them at that snapshot, at that moment. And that will be whatever anybody wants to present at that point. So they won't get an insight into all the tactics that have been used beforehand. That's the point where organisations can collude with the dominator, because he doesn't have to say anything. He's just like, just look at her. You know, she may not have had much sleep the night before. She's been dealing with things herself. There's been tactics used against her. But when they present to somebody, she might be quite annoyed, lack of sleep. She's quite irritable, but he'll be really composed. And, it's just an opportunity. I think if it's mixed like that, it's an opportunity to say, it's not me, it's her. It really is. But when the Freedom Programme is, men are able to go on it and women are able to go on it. So they're going through the same programme but separately, and no reports are being written. We're just going to see if the behaviour changes. I think that's quite effective. I think there's a danger when it's both people, and yes, there is female violence to male violence, but those percentages are really tiny.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is a difficult issue. Again, I think in social work, and children's social workers often encounter particularly those situations where they end up dealing with those situations. I suppose it is about those, like you were saying, it's about that definition of, are we calling that domestic violence, or is that just a form of violence, even though is domestic violence something quite distinct in terms of the need to be present, a pattern of coercive control and a pattern of behaviour, as opposed to in individual incidents of violence that might be brought about because of drinking, or do you know what I mean, all sorts of other things that doesn't mean that the violence is not problematic in a social work context. I suppose it's whether we define it as domestic violence rather than as just a pattern of violent behaviour. So yeah, I'm going to stop the questions there and just finish up, because it is now we've only got 3 minutes left. So just to thank everyone for contributing. I think that is it's been a really interesting discussion, and it's left me thinking about things that we can perhaps bring together in the future around domestic violence. I mean, at Wolverhampton, there's quite a few of us who are interested in research around domestic violence. We're currently, as I mentioned earlier, undertaking some research around understanding practitioners or service providers' experience of delivering services around domestic violence during COVID, which we are going to provide a webinar on at the end of May. But let's say, I think there's lots of food for thought there, and I think I would agree with you, Liz, that I think we need to do an awful lot more in terms of training around for social workers from my point of view, but around how what information people have about understanding domestic violence and what it is when they go into the field in order to work with people who are experiencing it. So thank you all. I mean, I think all of these projects are really interesting, and I think there is a real lack of availability of projects for men and stroke perpetrators of domestic violence, and perhaps from what you were saying, Nina, as well, and I don't know, I'm guessing, I think Amber and Lilli, your courses are predominantly face-to-face, but actually that COVID may have provided us with one thing, and that's an increase in services that are online, which may actually improve access for men going forward in a way that, I mean, I know in my practice experience, there's often been a real shortage of courses for perpetrators. So yeah, so thank you all very much. It's very much appreciated. We have got a webinar coming up in 2 weeks' time, which is on coercive control, which I think will feed in nicely. Some of the things we've been talking about will be really helpful in terms of thinking then about coercive control and what it is, and we may really explore those definitions of domestic violence. And the webinar after that is on mothers, domestic violence and social work interventions. So what we're going to do is explore the relationship between mothers' experiences of domestic violence and then what social workers do. So we'll be picking up on some of the things that have been discussed again, have been raised within this webinar around mother blaming and the focus of interventions on mothers. Most of those, all those webinars will be sent round the local authorities. I email those links round, but anyone else can find them on our Twitter feed, which is @WLV Social Work. And most of the things that we do in webinar terms will be on there. The webinar will be, it has been recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I'll try and get that done this week. So it will be available to people. And again, once it is uploaded, I'll put a link on our YouTube channel. There was something else and I've completely completely forgot. I had something else and it went completely.
Can I mention
yes.
something really quickly? I meant to say it a little bit earlier, and I think we started talking about something else. One of the myths is that something makes a perpetrator behave a particular way in the context of domestic violence. And I wanted to come back to his beliefs. And when we sometimes think it's through substance misuse or drinking, does that perpetrator, does he behave like that with absolutely everybody when he's drunk, or does he just decide he's going to beat her up? And that's when it comes back to the beliefs, because he feels a particular way about women and her. And I wanted to say that a little bit earlier, and I just couldn't get it in, but thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much. So yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. I think this has been a really interesting and engaging webinar. Thank you to Liz, to Amber and Lilli, and to Nina. Thank you so much. I think they have all been really interesting discussions. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing some of you at our next webinar. So thank you.